I know that it seems very unnatural in the time and place in which we live to even question the principle of self-ownership. Mark, do you have any doubts that we own ourselves? What is wrong with you? I think what is wrong with me is a capacity to see beyond the place and time in which I've been born and look at the big picture. The idea is that we own ourselves is a very American idea. It is a very libertarian idea. And I don't know if you've noticed this or not, but other countries don't really have libertarian parties in them. It's an American thing. There are green parties in lots of nations. Sometimes they're even in the government. But the libertarian idea is an American idea. We are a nation made up of individualists. The rugged individual is the American ideal. So for us, it's normative. But what I'm asking you to do for this video is sort of take a step back and ask yourself why you believe that. Do you believe that we own ourselves because you were born an American and it's a result of the American ideal and someone talked you into it and said, yeah, of course, it's a natural extension of human rights that we own ourselves? Or do you have a sound intellectual case as to why you own yourself? And what I find is that people have just assumed that it's true. It's one of those things that we hold these truths to be self-evident. We own ourselves. That's not what the Declaration of Independence says. It says something different than that. You might think it's a logical extension of that conclusion, but it isn't. And so when I say this, I don't want you all to hate on me. I know that not all libertarians even base their political philosophy on the principle of self-ownership. And I recognize that, delegation and symmetry and so forth, and hopefully I'll have more to say about those later as well. But I'm very sympathetic to libertarian ideals. I usually vote that way. I've given money to libertarians. I've worked with them on ballot access and issues like that. And I do think their best chance of ever getting their ideals implemented in the real world is through localism. That is, push for decentralization of state power, push all the rulemaking authority to the local level that is practical. And that way they can try out their libertarian ideas in a place, and if it works, then other places will see it and want to emulate it. Or maybe they'll learn something too, and will wind up finding what's best for the people that live there, which may not be best for the people that live elsewhere. That too is a part of freedom. That too is putting the government under free market forces. So let me start with defining self-ownership, and there's several names for it. This is from Wikipedia. Self-ownership, or sovereignty of the individual, or individual sovereignty, or individual autonomy, is the concept of property in one's own person, expressed as the moral or natural right of a person to have bodily integrity and to be the exclusive controller of his own body and life. According to G. Cohen, the concept of self-ownership is that each person enjoys over himself and his powers full and exclusive rights of control and use, and therefore owes no service or product to anyone else that he has not contracted to supply. And that is the principle of self-ownership, which also goes by those other names. It's the total opposite of collectivism. Under collectivism, you don't own yourself. The collective owns you, and you do whatever they tell you to. Your obligations are what they say they are. So it's the exact opposite. And localism is the middle ground. It's somewhere in between. The idea is that no, we are not born into this world without obligations. We're born into this world with obligations. And wherever we go, we're going to have obligations to the people that live around us. But we should have the choice of where that is, and we should have the choice of what those some input into what those obligations are. In other words, subject the government to free market forces. And if there's a libertarian place that has decided we're going to live under the principle of self-ownership, I'd say let them try it. And if it works, other places will emulate that and it will spread. If it doesn't work, then hopefully they too will correct. If they don't correct, people will just leave and there'll be nobody to govern. And that's the idea of localism and putting even the government under free market forces. But, this idea that we own ourselves, most nations right now, this would seem like nonsense to them. What seems self-evidently true to young Americans living and talking among themselves with like-minded friends would just seem utterly alien to most of the world and to most of human history. You go back to Rome. Rome had a lot of slaves. The idea that they owned themselves was nonsense. Their masters owned them. But the masters themselves, guess what? They didn't own themselves either. They had obligations to the state. They had obligations to their family. They had obligations to other members of their legion. If they were in a military unit, I guess they contracted that one. But I would say, of course, they took it too far. They went into fascism. They went into the idea of this massive central state. And that led to lots of evil in the world. But you got some hard choices even here. For example, let's say a man sleeps with a woman to whom he is not married. It's not a good idea. He gets her pregnant. Is he obligated to pay child support? Well, under the principle of self-ownership, he didn't contract to do that. Now someone might say, well, there's an implied contract. Really? If we can put implied contracts on each other, then there's no end to it. You're way back to the collective making the rules again. So you either go for the principle of self-ownership or you don't. And there's even more subtle situations where, let's say, defense spending. Now, I know here in America that we have become an empire rather than a republic. Most of our, what we call so-called defense spending, isn't even for our defense. It's for meddling in other countries and trying to rule the world on behalf of some warped personalities in the Beltway or beyond. I don't know who they're really working for, but I just know it's not us. So I understand that a lot of our defense spending right now is illegitimate. It's not really defense spending. But there is such a thing as legitimate defense spending. If you don't have a decent enough military, some other big country might use theirs to take over your government and run your life their way. So, how much do I owe for defense spending? Well, if I alone determine that, we have a problem. Because you cannot exclude me from the benefits of defense spending. If you have a big army here, say I'm Ukrainian and you build a big army to protect me from Russia, or if I'm an American and you build a big army to protect me from China, or what have you, or Taiwan and you protect me from China, you can't exclude me from the benefits of those. I benefit just being in there. I'm protected, even if I didn't agree to pay anything for defense spending. And so we have these public use goods where you can't exclude all the people who don't want to pay. So is there an obligation to pay under that scenario? If there is, then the principle of self-ownership, maybe it could still be a principle, but there would be common exceptions to that principle. And it certainly could not be taken as the absolute that Mr. Cohen and others would present it. Now, how did I first start thinking about this? Because I was kind of like most of you, like, of course I own myself. Who else would own me? Well, the obvious other answer would be the state or God. Those are the two other obvious, or your parents. And of course, when you're full adult, that it's more like your parents are your stewards until you reach age. So the other two obvious answers are the state and God. People started letting go of God, so the state was all they had left. So they said, oh no, I don't want that. I see how cruel the state is. I'll make it myself. But two things. One, there was a writer, George MacDonald. He wrote Christian children's books. He wrote treatises on natural law. Very brilliant man. He said, the first principle of hell is, I am my own. And I got to thinking about that. It's like, that sounds like self-ownership is the first principle of hell, according to George MacDonald. Why would he say such a thing? And it's because it puts your will above the obligations that you may have under a moral order that's bigger than you. It puts that moral order under your will. And you say, no, I don't want to take that obligation, or I do want to take that obligation. Whereas life may be trying to teach us that we do have obligation to others. We might have obligations to the people who raised us. We might have obligations to our neighbor. We might have obligations just due to the place and time we were born in history. Obligations to our children. And so the I am my own thing, taken to the nth degree, would sort of fray the ties that bind us. You know, we have our will, we have our desires, but we also are, each one of us are born into a world where others seem to have obligations for us. Are we bound by them? The principle of self-ownership would say, no, never. I would say we should consider whether we're bound by them and try to conform to a higher moral order that might exist. And if a higher moral order does not exist, then how is self-ownership a right? There really are no rights if a higher moral order doesn't exist. You're just saying you own yourself, but if I'm powerful enough to enslave you, if there's no higher moral order, then what's wrong with that? You just don't like it. That doesn't mean it's wrong. And so the idea that, that's the way Rome functioned, and that's the way, and I don't believe that's right. I think Rome was wrong, but that was their idea. So we have a situation here where what we think is normative for us is not really the human norm. It undermines, it does the same thing that the big state guys want, the central state people, and that should send off a red flag to you. They want us isolated from each other. They don't want us to have community. They want us atomized and our ties to each other reduced so that our dependence upon them when we slip and fall is going to be greater. And we find ourselves when we're young and strong and pretty or whatever, and all these people want to be friends with us. And as you get older, everybody has their own business and their own lives, and suddenly you spent your life demanding your autonomy and your space and your zone, and then you get there a little older and no one has any reason to talk to you anymore. And that's just the way the big state people want it. And I'm saying localism is that middle ground that beats them, because it does recognize that individuals have rights, but we also have obligations. And if you talk about ownership, like let's say I asked you, why do you think you own your paycheck? Or why do you think you own your car? And you might answer, hey, with my labor, I contracted to provide a service to my employer. I performed that service. I did what was required under the contract. So that's why he gave me my paycheck. It's mine. I earned it. I created the wealth that has gone into that paycheck with my work, and some more, which my employer benefited from. And that would be true. And if you took that paycheck and used it to buy a car, it would kind of be the same deal. You rewarded those whose effort made that car, and you compensated them, and they granted you their labor, the fruit of their labor. And all that is true. But have you noticed that nothing about that applies to you? The same ideas that you would use to show that you own your paycheck or your car do not apply to you. You didn't make yourself. You didn't earn yourself. You didn't determine when you came into this world, or where you came into this world, or when you'll leave this world, or how you'll leave this world. You are not sovereign over your life in the same sense that you are sovereign over your earnings or some property that you own. Maybe your life isn't your property. Can you prove that it is? Can you show that it is in the same way? I can't. I can't with my own life. I think that I'm here because of things done by my parents and many other people that I had no control over and no choice in. Now, if there is an afterlife, at some point we become the product of our choices. And that's kind of, I think, what this life is about. Us becoming the product of our own choices. So if there was an afterlife, I would say that self-ownership, like George MacDonald said, it's the first principle of hell. Well, guess what? In hell you will own yourself. In heaven you won't want to. But you have the right. You have become who you are. You have earned control of yourself by becoming that person through your choices. But we're talking about our life here, now, when we speak of the political. And I don't see, even in a situation where humans have rights, what America says, what the West says originally, was that man is endowed by his Creator with certain unalienable rights. Now, the fact that we have rights mean we own ourselves. It does not. But we still have rights. We still have things that, and what a right is a claim against the state. It's a claim against society, saying that this is my individual business, this is my area. Most of you may like it, most of you may not, but it doesn't matter because it's a right. I can say something you don't agree with. I can practice a religion you don't approve of, or not practice a religion, because these things are my rights. Now, does that mean that I'm completely sovereign in everything? Not necessarily. Our founders would not have considered that to be a logical conclusion from the premise that we have rights. So, again, it's not that I'm like hostile to the libertarian philosophy at all, and I don't agree with it. But as far as what it's doing in our nation, I'm supporting it. I believe in it as a force to decentralize our government. Now, where we go from there, if we ever get there, there may be a parting of the ways. But self-ownership is not a good thing in my mind. I don't see the case for it. Now, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments section. Explain to me where I'm going off here, please. I am not a person who has kept the same views that I've had when I was younger, and if necessary, if the evidence demands it, I'll change them again, and so should you. Thank you for listening, folks.